The empire had long been called eternal. Palaces gleamed with gold, its banners unfurled like fire in the wind, and its rulers declared themselves. Yet behind marble pillars and jeweled thrones lay corridors darkened by whispers. Of this empire, a prince was born, a boy destined to inherit a world already trembling at the edge of. His name was shrouded in reverence, yet among servants and courtiers given another name, the bleeding heir. From the day of his birth, the midwives had noticed something unusual. When his tiny body was pricked by the silver scissors that cut his umbilical cord, the bleeding did not stop. Cloth after cloth was stained crimson. First lullaby was the hushed prayer of terrified women. Tradition reassured the queen that some children were delicate, that the blood would clot in time. Yet the queen, pale and trembling, felt the shadow of a curse had entered her chambers. The king, proud and stern, dismissed these fears. "He is my son," he declared, lifting the fragile infant in arms that had once wielded swords. "He shall inherit steel, crown, and empire. No curse can undo the will of kings." But as the seasons turned, the palace learned that this prince was unlike any other. A single bruise upon his skin spread like ink through parchment, and the smallest fall left him writhing in agony. The courtiers began to whisper, "He bleeds like no other child. Perhaps he will never stop bleeding." Childhood in a royal palace was meant to be filled with tutors, swordplay, and the laughter of noble companions. Yet for the bleeding prince, it was an existence of shadows. The royal physicians forbade denied him riding lessons and kept him far from the training yards. His body was fragile as glass, his veins betraying him at every moment. While other princes grew with the clamor of war drums and the thunder of horses, this child grew among whispers and lamplight. His mother kept him cloistered in silk-draped chambers, his playmates chosen carefully, his toys soft and harmless. He would sit by the window, watching other boys train with swords, his pale face pressed against the cold glass, yearning for the world denied to him. But what pained him most was not the weakness of his body, it was the silence around his fate. No one dared to speak of his condition beyond hushed tones. His father called it delicacy, his tutors called it illness, and the priests called it God's trial. Yet no word could soften the truth. The empire's heir was cursed by his own blood. At night, when pain racked his limbs, the prince would whisper to his mother, "Why was I born to bleed?" And the queen, hiding her tears, would answer, "Because even blood can carry destiny, my child." The illness of the prince was not merely a family tragedy, it was a state secret. For in those days, weakness in the royal bloodline was a signal to vultures. Dynasties circled like wolves, foreign courts sent spies, and the nobility within the empire whispered of replacing the heir. The king forbade all mention of his son's condition. Physicians were sworn to secrecy. Servants who spoke too freely vanished from the palace, threatened with eternal silence. The empire presented the image of a strong, divine heir, even as behind closed doors, the boy screamed in pain from bleeding joints and swollen limbs. Yet rumors seeped through the cracks of marble walls. Some whispered the queen had consorted with witches, that the child bore the mark of sorcery. Others claimed it was punishment from God, a sign that the dynasty was cursed. A darker whisper spread in taverns and barracks, that the boy was already dead, and the palace showed only doubles and illusions to keep the empire stable. The bleeding prince lived in the center of these shadows, his very existence a mystery even to his own people. One winter, when the prince's suffering grew unbearable, the queen sought help beyond the court physicians. She summoned mystics, healers, and men of strange reputation. Most were charlatans, peddling herbs and prayers. Yet one man, dressed in black robes, lingered in the corridors of the palace, his eyes dark as coal, his voice soft as velvet. He claimed he could still the blood. He claimed the boy's veins listened to voices not of earth, but of the unseen. The king dismissed him as a fraud, but the queen, desperate, allowed him to stay. And it was said that when the prince's cries echoed through the night, this man in black knelt by his bed, murmured strange prayers, and the bleeding slowed. The boy himself felt the presence of something otherworldly. In the stranger's voice, he heard both comfort and danger, as if each word balanced between salvation and damnation. From that winter on, the bleeding prince was no longer only a child of sorrow. He became the center of a darker intrigue, the pawn of faith healers, mystics, and manipulators. The court, already fractured by ambition, now turned its eyes not just on the king, but on the fragile child who might one day wear the crown. The empire's enemies learned of the prince's condition. Letters intercepted on the borders spoke of conspiracies, nobles who plotted to depose the boy, generals who doubted his ability to lead armies, foreign rulers who prepared alliances against the empire's weakness. In taverns, men laughed that the throne would one day be held by a boy who could be killed by a bruise. Among the royal cousins, jealousy festered. One cousin, strong and warlike, began to present himself as the true heir, whispering that only a man of iron could save the empire from collapse. The king stood firm, declaring his bleeding son to be the rightful successor. Yet as the prince grew older, his suffering only worsened. At times he could not walk, his joints swollen with blood. At other times fevers racked him, leaving him pale as a corpse. And always in the shadows of the palace, the man in black robes watched. By his 15th year, the bleeding prince was both legend and ghost. His people rarely saw him, but his name was spoken in prayers, curses, and rumors. Some said he was immortal, for he had survived wounds that should have killed him. Others said he was already dead, and that his ghost walked the palace halls. The boy himself felt as though he lived on borrowed time. Each fall, each bruise, each whisper of pain might be the one that ended him. Yet within him burned a strange fire. He longed not just to live, but to rule, to prove that his destiny was not written by blood, but by will. He began to write secret letters to his cousins, to his generals, even to foreign rulers, declaring that he would be strong enough to inherit the crown. In the ink of his words, he sought to silence the crimson ink of his body. But fate is not so easily rewritten. For in the winter of his 16th year, a fall from his horse left his body swollen with internal bleeding. For days he lay on the edge of death, the palace cloaked in dread. And once again, the stranger in black robes entered his chambers. The boy survived, but the empire had changed. The people, restless from famine and war, began to doubt their rulers. Nobles plotted, generals muttered, and the dynasty trembled like glass. All eyes turned to the bleeding prince, wondering whether his life was salvation or doom. And in the depths of the palace, the boy himself began to dream strange dreams, of rivers of blood flowing through the throne room, of crowns floating on crimson tides, of himself seated on a throne of bone. He awoke each night with his sheets stained red, his breath heavy, his eyes hollow. Yet in his frailty, there was a new determination, almost madness. He whispered to his mother, "If my blood must fall, let it fall on a crown." The empire grew restless. In cities, bread riots swelled. In the countryside, peasants whispered of omens. The bleeding prince, though hidden within his chambers, had become the very symbol of fragility. Courtiers who once bowed to him now debated his replacement. Generals swore loyalty with their lips, yet sharpened their swords in secret. The king stood defiant. "My son shall inherit," he declared before the council, his voice echoing like iron. But in the silence that followed, he saw the truth in their eyes. Doubt had infected the heart of his realm. The bleeding prince, though frail, sensed this tide. He begged his father to let him appear before the people, to show them that he still lived. Against the physician's warnings, a grand procession was arranged. The day came with banners unfurled, trumpets blazing. The prince was lifted upon a white horse, his pale face hidden beneath a crown heavy with jewels. He smiled, forcing strength into his fragile body. The crowd roared, but their roar was not of triumph. It was of wonder, fear, pity. For even as he waved, his hand trembled, and red drops stained his white glove. The people gasped, and in that gasp, the empire's destiny shifted. Not long after the procession, the conspiracy began. A faction of nobles, fearing the collapse of the empire under a bleeding ruler, plotted to end the dynasty's curse. They whispered in taverns, signed letters in hidden chambers, and even reached out to the foreign cousin who had long coveted the throne. The queen learned of the plot too late. Her warnings to the king were dismissed as hysteria. "No man would dare strike against my son," the king declared. But that very night, the palace walls were breached, not by invaders, but by betrayal from within. The bleeding prince awoke to the sound of steel. His guards lay dead, the corridors echoing with hurried footsteps. Servants fled, priests cowered, and through the flickering torchlight came men he had once called uncles and cousins. He tried to rise, but pain lanced through his joints. He fell back, his sheets once again soaked in crimson. The conspirators stood at his bedside, staring down at the fragile heir. "Forgive us, cousin," one whispered. "The empire cannot bleed with you." The boy smiled faintly, his lips pale. "It already bleeds," he said, "and it shall drown you all." Moments later, steel found his heart. The conspirators declared a new heir, the warlike cousin who promised to save the realm. The bleeding prince's body was hidden, his death silenced. Official proclamations claimed he had retired to a monastery, devoting his life to prayer. But whispers spread faster than proclamations. In villages, people swore they had seen his ghost walking the night, his robes dripping crimson. In taverns, men cursed the traitors, declaring that the murdered heir would haunt the empire. And in the palace itself, the marble floors seemed forever stained with unseen red. The man in black robes vanished that same night, never to be seen again. Some said he had fled in fear. Others claimed he had been a demon all along, summoned by the queen's desperation. Whatever the truth, his shadow lingered in every whispered tale. The new ruler tried to silence these stories, but they grew like wildfire. For in the imagination of the people, the bleeding prince was not dead. He was eternal, a curse upon those who had spilled royal blood. The years that followed were drenched in war, famine, and rebellion. The warlike cousin who seized the throne proved ruthless, but not invincible. His battles drained the empire, his cruelty fractured the nobility, and his reign was marked by endless uprisings. And always, the legend of the bleeding prince grew stronger. Mothers told their children of a boy ghost who bled for justice. Soldiers swore they saw him in the smoke of battle, a pale figure with crimson hands. Priests whispered that his blood had cursed the throne, that no ruler would ever know peace again. In time, the empire crumbled, not from one single blow, but from 1,000 cuts, like the body of the prince himself, wounded from within. Urdu Miliko.